Good evening to all the Tuesday techies. Unfortunately, yesterday we could not finish our conversation due to our national problem, which is load shedding. Tonight we have a very esteemed guest, Dr. Jacob Medupe, who has done a lot of work around what I would call onboarding rural communities. In his PhD thesis, he focused on a strategy for sustainable ICT development in the deep rural communities. And many of you who have watched before would know that I'm very passionate about rural communities myself. I come from a village, and the reality is that in as much as we are able to have these conversations, sometimes having these conversations even in rural areas, it's still a challenge today in South Africa. A challenge which in the last conversation we had when we had the deputy chairperson of the NYDA, where she mentioned that we need to experience uninterrupted services. And unfortunately, because we do not have these, we will always be susceptible to any disruptions in our daily lives. And which happened yesterday, where we had planned to have a conversation yesterday, and we had a disruption. And unfortunately, there are impacts to this, but on this one, I'm not the expert. Dr. Medupe is the expert on this. With that welcoming note, Dr. Medupe, I would like you to just say a few words, maybe perhaps, so that we can have our conversation for tonight.
Alrighty. Thank you very much, Mema Khachane. And I must really say, when you invited me, for a conversation, I felt very humbled, first of all, because as you know, there's many experts, in the space. And when the invitation came through, I sort of, and we had a conversation about this, in terms of the approach that we need to take. But I thought maybe as an introduction tonight, and I'm really hoping that, their introduction, would at least motivate our listeners out there. I thought I should just speak briefly on my background.
Okay.
Who is Jacob Medupe? I was born and bred in a small farm outside of Klerksdorp, and we're a family of 8. So it was quite a big family, and I was a third born in that family. I went through my primary and secondary education in Joburg location in Klerksdorp. And I started my university career at Wits University, as you'd know that, Wits, UCT, Natal, those were like, quite prestigious universities that any kid during the time in the early 90s, would aspire and wish that I would really wish one to be at Wits at some point. I went to Wits as a mining engineer student, through an Anglo-American scholarship. That was in 1991. Way back, I'm giving away my age now. Way back in the day. And I got overwhelmed by the environment. And unfortunately, I could not cope with my studies. It was quite a very new environment. I dropped out on my second year. And I had to go at 1 year, I worked for a year in the mines. But I then gave it another shot and I said, I want to do this thing. Then I got another scholarship to go study at UDW, which is now the UKZN, for a bachelor's of degree. And the scholarship was through what we called back then Educational Opportunities Council. And I did my bachelor's of science and surprise, my first degree, I only attained it at the age of 28. That was a bachelor's of science. I then enrolled for my MBA, a little bit crazy, immediately, almost immediately after my bachelor's. I then enrolled for my MBA with Potchefstroom Business School, which is the Northwest University. And that was then conferred, the degree was conferred in 20. An issue with not being able to finish my degree at Wits. So I felt like I had an unfinished business. I went back to Wits University to enroll for my master's in engineering. telecommunication. And surprise, surprise, I managed to complete, master's engineering with VETS in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be of interest that in all this, coming from a very big family, my parents,
Mm-hmm.
ordinary, they did not have the means, to take me through university. But in every degree that I have attained to date, there was a scholarship or a bursary that took me through. I then, after my master's engineering, in 2013, I then took a final leap of faith on my education by enrolling for a PhD with Nelson Mandela University, which was quite a huge step, to be honest with you. And that was in 2014. And I completed that degree in 2019. And that's, the study was so fully funded by the National Research Foundation, and so one really can count himself blessed and lucky in this instance that all my education, from my B degree, to my PhD, were fully funded. And my research area, as you have indicated, which is quite a very pertinent subject, my research area was sustainability of the implementation of ICT strategies in rural areas. And where does that come from? And the reason why I took that approach is that I have been in the industry for quite some time. And I have seen what the government has put in, in terms of resources, have actually, have channeled resources into rural communities, but most of the projects that were rolled out or are still being rolled out, as it were not sustainable back then. And, one wanted to really to to investigate what is the problem. Where are where are the loops, where are the gap? How can we then make sure that whatever that get implemented, to bridge the digital divide, get sustained, and we are able to get benefit out of that. After taking a leap of faith, for my PhD, I thought I should also give a brief background in terms of from the career point of view where I come from. I started at Telkom as a technical officer in 1998 and went to join Siemens as a senior systems engineer in the early 2000s. Now, the interesting thing about me joining Siemens, when I joined Siemens, we were the first group of engineers, what we call today the data networks or whatever that we are using now, as, for our internet access. We were the first bunch of, group of engineers who first introduced the data networks through Siemens, for Vodacom as a client in this instance, where we introduced what we call a GPRS network, which was a second generation data network way back in the day. That was in early 2000. I then joined Centec as a technical support manager. And Centec is it's a signal distributor. It's a broadcasting, company where I occupied the various positions until I joined Parliament in 2015 as a content advisor. And there I was basically, advising a portfolio committee on telecoms and postal services. So my experience is quite diverse, in the space, whether it's from the technical point of view, the policy making space, and now I'm at the CSI App as a research group leader, and I'm leading several researchers, under my portfolio. And there we are also doing, a splendid job. So that's my, who Jacob is, as it were. And I'm not sure if you would want me to go into what entailed or what went into my research work and the findings, and what we sort of came up with, as part of the research findings. And that's who Jacob Medupe is in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you very much for actually taking the lead and actually showing us that these things can be done. You can come from a big family, you can come from a disadvantaged family, but this can be done. And it doesn't mean that what I have, maybe it's a very limited sample, but what I have realized in my journey or in life, my very limited life experience, is that once a child goes to standard 6 or what they call grade 8, and they don't see how they're going to go beyond matric, something happens to them where they stop even studying harder to actually get those distinctions. There's sort of like an automatic something that discourages kids to actually push harder and say, I'm gonna get that bursary. It doesn't mean because I'm from Dunugana I cannot go beyond that. it's a very, very small portion of kids where I've seen where they don't use, or where their family circumstances do not push them down. And I hope that we can actually, even, your introduction, we can share it more further to show more people that it doesn't end here. There are opportunities if you actually work hard. You dropped out, but you managed to actually get funding again for your studies. And you have to be in that position to get that funding.
Precisely. Maybe if I may add as well, if I may add on that as well, maybe if I may interrupt with the audience and the listeners, is that I was not the smartest student, in high school, but I worked very hard because, background where coming from a family of 8 it's a very big family, and as you would know, my mother was a domestic servant. My father was a carpenter, so we did not have, some of the basic necessities all the time. And one was then motivated that on the basis of, that type of a background, I really wanted to be a better person tomorrow. And I then made a conscious decision that education is one of the, the most viable vehicle, to take me out of that abject poverty. And I'm not saying that today I'm rich. I'm not saying that. But all that I know is that I remain employable, and I'm able to, to use the skills acquired over the years, to sustain my livelihood. And that, I think, on its own, it's what I really want a poor child in the deep rural, Eastern Cape, if, they're listening at all tonight. And we know that, this is the subject matter today, that it is doable. You can do it. You can come out of poverty, and education is one of the most viable vehicle to make sure that you come out of that, poor environment.
Thank you very much. Dr. Medupe, we've been mentioning your PhD thesis. I would like to know, because we sometimes experience things, but it could be that we are just the exception, the internet interruptions that we were talking about. What were the findings of your thesis or your research?
I'm going to, in a nutshell, Karabe, and I think, and I'm hoping that this is going to assist us in having a conversation. When I first started my research, my research work, it was based on the work that I did, back in the day, particularly with, Centec, which is a state-owned, as internet connectivity solutions. And one of those things that we rolled out, it's what we used to call back in the days, the telecenters. Now, what happened more often than not is that most of these initiatives, when they get rolled out and get implemented by government, you'll find that sustainability lack of sustainability thereof becomes a major problem. Now, in my study, one of the things that were identified is that for the ICT strategy, for the sustainable ICT intervention, we need to make sure that the certain things that I intentionally, are put in place. And there are certain areas that were clearly identified as the problematic areas in this instance. The absence of policies which favor the poor and relevant regulatory framework was one of the biggest problems back then. Things might have changed today, but policy frameworks that favored the rural communities decisively, that was one of the biggest problems. That was, that was one of the findings. And one of the other things that is also a problem today, the widely, sparse population. We know that the rural communities, it's so sparse that, the households are very far from each other. And that as well was found as that was a second problem. The third problem that we found in the space was the uneven landscape, which would make installations very expensive. Now you'll find in these instances, companies, and I'm going to mention them, companies such as your big corporates, your Vodacom, your Cellsys, and your MTN, they are reluctant, to go to this, places because the business model is just not sustainable. More often than not, those communities are unable to pay for the services that me and you in urban areas are able to pay for. The low investment initiatives due to the perceived small return on investment, as I've indicated, was also one of the findings, in the study. The reliable supporting infrastructure such as electricity, would know what happened yesterday. The load, what we are grappling with at the moment is the reliable, energy sources. Energy security is the problem. Now it's worse. It's worse within the rural communities. So electricity was also one of the biggest problems. The lack of the technical expertise, managerial skills within the space, because once you have deployed some of this or implemented some of the solution, you need the local communities will be able to make sure that these things are maintained and they're taken care of. So lack of technical expertise was one of the problems as well. The rampant and undesirable levels of computer illiteracy, that became also one of the findings, within our, what we discovered during our research work. And what the other subject that we spoke about the other day, the absence of innovation, which resulted in minimal local content development. So those were, in a nutshell, one can expand on that, but in the nutshell, those were some of the things that during the study that we discovered.
Okay. We're talking about this. So basically, when we look at our technological ecosystem in South Africa, these becomes our restrictions. How can we actually overcome these restrictions?
One of the things that we clearly outlined during the study, remember we were working out a strategy that would ensure sustainability. Some of the factors that we, very, very, very high level that we emphasized during the study was that, for this strategy to be successful, there were various things that we needed to do very intentionally. We needed to ensure that the requirements of people benefit from the clearly understood. Until such time that you understand what is the actual problem and what is that the people need on the ground, to make sure that once the services are deployed and rolled out, they are able to, to use these services, very efficiently and effectively, and are benefiting them appropriately. So we need to ensure that the requirements of the people on the ground within those rural communities are clearly understood. In the absence of that, we are going to be rolling out networks or solutions that are of no use to those communities. The second thing that we, as a study, that we said that for this to be sustainable, we need to ensure that the market assessment and environmental scaling is undertaken and is understood, and the circumstance of the affected users is also clearly understood. One thing that I think as South Africa, and I think if you remember, if you've been following the telecom cases, with regard to the, the allocation of the new spectrum, is that we have not, as a country, we have not undertaken, an exercise. And in the absence of that, if that area or if that part is not clearly understood, whatever that you're going to be providing as solutions, it's going to be, you don't understand your market. Obviously, in the absence of sustainability becomes a problem. And one of the things that that we also clearly outlined, that for this to be sustainable, we need to focus on capacity building for ease of adoption. More often than not, when these things, and I've experienced that with my my current, some of the projects that we have undertaken as a CSR at the moment, is that capacity building, where we make sure that when these solutions are rolled out within the communities, there is at least enough capacity to sustain the solutions. That has been a problem over the years, and that is still a problem even today. The other thing, the other pointer that we also highlighted, that would ensure that this, the sustainability on this, is to identify and highlight the development priorities and challenges facing the country. Until such time that we know what is the problem that we are trying to solve here, we're just gonna be beating around. It will be, whatever that we try to come up with, it's just not going to work. you know. And the other, three more pointers. We need to explore the integrated approach to ICT development and deployment.
Mhm.
Until such time that that integrated approach, is adopted and undertaken. And I must say that government has done some work, but there's still a lot more that is still required to be done in the space. But that's what the study sort of, high level, that sort of, discover. Address the lack of technical, as I've indicated, and managerial skills to use and apply ICT services, and be in line with the country poverty reduction plans, such as your NDP, blueprint.
Okay.
Identified that in the absence of us making sure that those things are addressed, sustainability becomes an issue.
I'm going to ask a very a wild card question here. You've spoken about what you found out, and you spoke about how it can be overcome. But in all of this, what worries me, maybe personally, is our lack of innovation. Or do we have a competitive advantage anywhere in the ecosystem? And what is actually stopping us from having a competitive advantage in this space?
One of the biggest problem, Karaba, and I'm going to go back to our education system. What the system is churning out, as graduates in this instance, it's not necessarily what the market is looking for. So there's some serious misalignment in what the market is sort of ready for, and what our education system is sort of churning out. It is for the very reason that more often than not you'll find a student, a graduate by the street corner with a placard. I've got a BTech degree in engineering, but I'm still unemployed. The simple one of the simplest reasons why is that still happening is that our curricula, or our the course structure that is being offered by most of the institutions of higher learning, they don't necessarily speak into what the market is demanding. And until such time that the industry and the institutions of higher learning, they find each other in terms of what are the most pertinent skill sets that we're looking for as a country. Until we come to that, that understanding, I can tell you now, we'll still be grappling with these issues in many, many years to come.
Okay. So we already know that we have a structural problem in terms of skills. And then we perpetuate the wrong type of education, if I may say that. In one of the articles, you mentioned that one of the problems is that how we study or how we are being assessed is that you study till you cram whatever is here, and then you are tested on what you crammed. But there's no creativity in what you said. And you mentioned, I think that's the 6 C's or the 4 C's. Can you just show me how can we change the ecosystem by using the 4 C's and the capacity and the skills that we need in the market?
You are breaking up a bit. How can we change? Just repeat the last part again.
How can we change our skills and capacity using the 4 C's that I've seen that you mentioned creativity. You mentioned using optional things to it. So how can we actually use those 4 C's and change our skills and align it to what is needed in the market?
The sooner we get to understand, Karabo, that the traditional way of offering education, the world has evolved, and the unfortunate thing is that we are now on what we call the fourth industrial revolution, era. How we used to to offer, and the traditional way of how we used to offer and present the knowledge acquisition back in the day it's no longer the same. So the first thing that we really need to make sure that we as we have both the basic education and the higher education department, and one of the things that during the lekgotla of the basic education that Ntate Nxasana was saying is that one of the unfortunate thing, who was one of the the basic education department, they are not in a meaningful conversation with the head in terms of what is coming out of the high school. It's sort of necessarily ready for the higher education, education, higher education, institutions. So he was saying that the sooner we get to make sure that as basic education, between basic education and the D head, in this instance, the sooner they get to find each other and make sure that there is some sort of an alignment in terms of the kids that comes out of the higher education high school setup are sort of ready for university. So when they go into university, they sort of, we then avoid issues where there's so much of, dropout kids, from universities, because we need to make sure that the basic education is in full alignment with what, they'll be made ready for what the, higher education, be able to, to take on board and assimilate and make sure that when they get, to that environment and space, are able to cope enough and understand, what is being offered at that level. So much so that, it becomes easy for them, to have that, an easy way of thinking, creative thinking, come out of that system of, of higher education. They're sort of ready. Now, what happens more often than not, these kids, when they get to their first year university life, they struggle in trying to adjust in this new way of doing things, because the secondary schooling, of their life has not prepared them enough to make sure that we are struggling. I said to you, my first 2 years at VES was a nightmare. I had to drop out of university for my mining engineering, studies. It's because I was coming from a secondary, education system that did not prepare me enough so that when I get to VETS, I'll be able to, to cope, a lot better and be able to understand what is that is being offered, to me. So often than not, the first, second year of the university student life, we are trying to, to acclimatize, to get used to the environment. And in the process, we lose on what is expected of us when we come out of the system.
Okay. I've got one question. Would you say that we should perhaps move towards the German type of system, where it actually sort of there's that bridge where you're not immediately expected to go to university immediately after high school? You're expected to at least maybe go have some technical skills. Would that actually be the bridge where we can actually even optimize on our TVET colleges?
You know what, Karab, Africa has got unique, problems. And when President Becky says that as Africans, we need to make sure that we develop our own African solutions, to our own African problems. Our problems, and this is what I always, when we do presentation in conferences around the education system, is that by adopting what comes out of Europe, it's not necessarily that type of a system might be working in Europe, but Africa is unique. There's a whole lot of policy issues. There's a whole lot of political instabilities. There's a whole lot of very huge infrastructure deficit. We are not Europe in this instance, remember. So our problems are very unique, in their own way. So until such time that and what sort of solutions that would be better appropriate to make sure that our challenges are fully addressed, I think the better. Some of these things, some of this foreign ideas and platform and technologies and how they do things and systems, they are good in their own way. We can pick and choose what sort of maybe we can use as a base to to start from. But let's remember that Africa is unique. And this is what when we did, a 4IR strategy as a CSR for the African Union, this is what we emphasized, that in as far as, as a continent, we're coming up with a, 4IR strategy for the continent. But one thing that we need to remember is that whatever that we're going to adopt as solutions in trying to resolve or at least, address our challenges, is that our challenges are unique to what is in Europe. So we need to be very, very careful in terms of what and this thing of important technology also as well. We necessarily are not bringing into the continent what would work for the continent, and I think that's what has really put us on a back foot more often than not. So I think as Africa, as Africans, we need to fully understand what is that we're faced with, what are our challenges, and what would work for us. We can take what is in Europe, customize it, make sure that it is tailor-made and able to to at least speak into what we faced with as a continent.
Thank you very much. I'm happy that you are very, you are saying what we need is an African solution. I'm looking at even the rollout of, 5G, the need for for buildings to be closer and for them to actually be, and you just mentioned earlier on, you mentioned the Eastern Cape and the sparsity between the buildings, that in as much as we would like to roll out the 5G, the 6G, our infrastructure is completely different from Europe, where everything is close together. The streets, the buildings are like, everybody's crammed into one space instead of us being sparsely, distributed. And how can, innovation, how can we actually look at that and change, how we bring innovation, which are, contextualized to our environment?
One of the unfortunate things, and we are still, as a country, we still are grappling with that. And I'm not too sure how much of those discussions you've been following. It's the, the digital dividend, spectrum that is sitting with the broadcasters. Now, today, I think it was today when I read that ETV, now, the Department of Communication and Digital Technologies have been trying DTT, now, what has been happening over there, that project has been delayed and prolonged, where we needed to move the broadcasters in one of the most, proficient, efficient, spectrum that the country needs so much, where if we were to take that spectrum band within the 700, for those who understand these things, the 700 range and the 800 range, which is much, much better, in terms of radius and coverage, can be much more suitable for the rural communities. Now, what has been happening in that, which is so unfortunate for the country, we have not managed to, to make sure that the transition, from analog to digital within the broadcasting space, where the broadcasters are able to vacate that much needed, spectrum for the rural communities. That process has unfortunately seriously delayed. And in the process, it has affected, the country's development, particularly the rural communities. Because once you get, the broadcasters vacated that much needed spectrum, then the issue of, the sparsely, populated rural communities where they are far from each other, it's a non-issue. So the issue of the digital migration from analog to digital has been a big problem. And guess what? Today, ETV has launched another court case with the Concord that we need to hold and stop the switch of the analog. And that has got some serious bearings, in making sure that those rural communities that are not covered today, using this much needed spectrum, that are able to be covered and able to enjoy what me and you at this point in time is able to enjoy. So as long as this issue of, the spectrum allocation, it's still a big problem. We're not gonna go into a space where we say my grandmother back in rural Eastern Cape has got a proper coverage and can enjoy the 5G that I'm enjoying in Sandton.
I'm glad that you mentioned the spectrum. On the 3rd of May, we are going to have ICASA to explain the spectrum properly, in depth. But also what you're saying about the ETV court case, on Sunday, they had, in all the major Sunday papers, they had a whole spread where they were talking about how this, moving from analog to digital is actually censorship. So we do need those type of conversations. Although somebody would say that it is a matter in court, maybe we should not touch it. But such things have impact on the general population. And we should have that conversation. And I think maybe sometimes we're too afraid to have the conversation because, it's a matter in court, or it's a big service provider that is actually against us moving into a digital space.
Yes.
That being okay. That being said, we mentioned load shedding earlier on in our conversation. Are we actually calculating the cost of load shedding on development and education?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question, and I'm not too sure I'm the person who's better placed, but I can tell you what we are doing at CSIR, to make sure that when we roll out solutions or roll out networks in rural communities, those become sustainable. That I can because there's one project that we have undertaken through the Department of Rural Development, where we roll out what we call digital doorways. Now, digital doorways are some sort of, and this is an intellectual property of the CSIR, where we have developed a very robust solution. It's like a kiosk, but in this instance, it's a very robust kiosk where these things of breaking in and stealing computers, it's something of the past. We have developed such a solution, and that solution is then have what we call, for energy sources. It's fully kitted with solar panels. We don't need, to hook it up into the ESCOM grid. So most of those kiosks that at the moment that we are rolling out as a CSIR within the rural communities, they are self-sustained, from the energy point of view. But yet again, Karabo, the biggest problem and one does not want to be, politically incorrect in this instance. But yet again, from the government point of view, in as much as the CSIR, we have come up with this beautiful solution, a wonderful solution, something that is very sustainable, very robust. That kiosk key, when it's locked, you can't break into it, you can't steal anything into it. Very robust. It's solar paneled. It's the energy sources are sort of reliable. There's robust computers that have been installed in the kiosk key, and that's a solution that we've provided in order to circumvent or to deal with the issue of the unstable, ESCOM problem or the electricity problem in this instance. So that's what we have come up with, as a CSIR, and I can tell you now that's one of the the most very type of product that we came up with, and it's working. But yet again, and many other issues that I have referred to, digital literacy, making sure that there's full maintenance on those things, those become still very prevalent and pertinent issues. But I wanted to add as well, Karabo. I wanted to add, maybe before you come in terms of innovativeness, in the space, particularly in the rural communities. As the CSIR, we have had a project where we fully developed, a TV. It's a technology that uses, if I were to call it, some of the chunks of the spectrum within the 700, 800, band that are most lucrative, that are not necessarily being used, most of the time. Now, the TV white space, it's one of the solutions that if we were to be able to cover, the sparsely populated, rural communities, the TV white space is one of the technologies that has been, come out very, very, and we've tested this. We have deployed some of this in the rural Eastern Cape, and it has proven to be working. But one of the things that was a constraint in that space was the policy finalization, making sure that some of these things, there's a policy that is very clear in terms of how to deploy, how to use them, make sure that they benefit the rural communities.
Okay. I've got more questions about that, especially where we can't deploy what we already have. And, I keep asking, how do we overcome this? Because at some point we must have, a point of consensus where we say, this is how we're moving as a country. We look at North Korea and how it has developed even in the past 20 years. I don't even want to go in the past 50 years because it's a different country altogether. You look at, Thailand, and then you compare it to Ghana and you compare it to South Africa, and you look at where they are and how far they've moved.
And Singapore.
How can we deploy? Because we clearly, one thing about South Africa, we have some of the best researchers. We have come up with so many innovations. Just the WhatsApp that we're using on a daily basis, it's a South African product. How can we deploy more of our, innovations and make sure that they actually become more beneficial to the ordinary person in a rural community? Because most of our communities, more than 40% of the population in South Africa is still residing in rural communities.
You know what, Carol? And you really are going to put me in trouble in this case. And I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. Like as you say, we have entities such as and if I were to tell you the IPs that we are selling with, as a CSIR, on an annual basis, we get what we call parliamentary grants to develop solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And we get in that, without faith. Like my research group in the last financial year, I got 7 million rand to develop a digital transformation strategy for Gauteng, and that we have done.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens after that? We take that product, we put it on the shelf. It gathers dust, So, and I don't want to go into the politics in the space, and I don't want to say the political will. And I mean, if you look at the entities such as the CSR, and I'm not promoting the CSR in this instance, but if you're to look at the entities such as the CSR in terms of the capacity that you are sitting with from the innovation point of view, the brain power that you're sitting. Let me give you a context. And there's various clusters and and impact areas and competencies that it's a very huge campus that we are about 46 buildings, and each one of those buildings has got a certain competency. Like the ICT space, there's e-waste, there's defense and security, there's cybersecurity, there's manufacturing. So it's various competencies that are sitting everywhere. As a CSIR, we are a staff complement of 2,700 people. And about 700 of those, and one is not saying, and maybe that's one aspect that critically going forward we need to look into, because this thing of discarding and not wanting to prioritize that the brain power that we're sitting with, we need to make sure that we leverage that. CSIR is a government entity, funded by government, giving the taxpayers money. We are sitting with it's a staff complement of 2,700. 700 of those are definitely are doctoral degrees and professors. And we are sitting with huge competency. And that's huge. At time, we come up, we would go scan the market. What is the problem? Would be given money, develop solutions, develop competencies, develop frameworks, and we've been doing this over the years. But what do those do? Once we are completed, like I've just finished a project where I developed a digital transformation strategy for Gauteng government. I can tell you now, I've put the report together, I've put the framework together, I'm going to put it on the shelf, and I'm going to move into the new year, another bunch of budget, another area that needs to be addressed. But those things are not necessarily being taken and implemented. And be rest assured, from my time in Parliament, from the policy making and legislative space, we have, as it has always been said over the years, we have some of the most beautiful policies. There's a national that is strategy. It has clearly outlined what needs to happen in order to make sure that every citizen in the country has got an internet coverage. I'll give you a very simple example. One of the things that the strategy has recommended is that all the ICT, particularly within your Centec, your Broadband Infraco, and some other entities, they need to be rationalized, and where there's, common areas, those entities put together and make sure that we optimize on what we have as a country and as a government in this instance. To date, most of those recommendations have not been, implemented. So I don't know, it's a political will, but let me not go into politics. Let me leave it at that.
Okay. I would not want to actually get you into trouble, with the conversations. But unfortunately, these conversations, when you look at them, and then you look at maybe, for instance, even when you travel and you get to Japan or you get to Europe, and then it feels like you are in another world altogether, where you don't have to worry about having, data bundles.
Yes.
You see an orange pole, you already know that there's free Wi-Fi here. Sustainable,
Yes.
stable, free Wi-Fi. And these communities are approximately 10 years ahead of us in terms of development. But we're also competing with them on the same scale every day, for resources, for anything else. We are competing with them. And unfortunately, I would like us to have another conversation. Maybe also, I should put it to you that in June, we are planning to have a hackathon. And this hackathon is to bring solutions from young people. It will be based on people between 16 and 25, where we would expect them to actually come up with solutions. And some of them being mentored by people like yourselves, to actually say, this is how you can move when you're 16. You don't have to be a teacher. And it's okay for you not to want to have, a career where you want to say, I want to solve this specific solution, where we want to move kids also from moving from, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a doctor. For example, when you went to university, what you're doing now was not even a career then, had not been developed then. So maybe perhaps changing also our children's minds. With that being said, I want you to say, how can we change things as we come to wrap up our conversation? How can we change things as South Africa? And that, in the next year or two, what would you love to see happening in the country?
Yeah, you kept on, you were breaking up a bit, but I think your question was that how can we change things, and in South Africa, to make sure that we're able to, to at least be able to be comparable to the Rwandas of this world. I'll tell you, and more often than not, I have conversations with, public, servants. One of the things that, and I'll give the case, the Rwandan case, the ICT related matters in Rwanda are primarily the prerogative and are sitting entirely in the presidency office. And Paul Kagame has taken ownership of making sure that Rwanda is a fully digitalized, country. Granted, we have had the national, 4IR strategy, well and good. But I can tell you now, without being, being a, a pessimist in this instance, it's a beautiful piece of document. And what we did for Gauteng as a CSIR, from the technical expertise point of view, we took that PC4R strategy, or the national 4R strategy, and we cascaded that down to the province. And we developed, together with Prima Makura, a 4IR strategy for Gauteng in this instance. And some of the recommendation in terms of, and those are very implementable, what needs to be done. There were clear recommendation from your smart energies, your smart transportation, your smart health, anything. I mean, all those smart things. The strategy, it was quite a comprehensive exercise. What needs to happen? All that is left now, it is the implementation. We put resources into those things. We implement the recommendations. And I can tell you now, there's nothing that is stopping us from being and we're not saying that Singapore are, but there's nothing that is stopping us comparatively competing with the Singapores, competing with the Japans, competing with even in the country with the Rwanda. I mean, with Rwanda, there's nothing that is because we have all these frameworks that we have put together. Beautiful recommendation. Captains of the industry were involved. Beautiful brains that were put together by Primakura, and that strategy fully outlined in terms of what needs to happen in making sure that at least Gauteng as a province, it is taken forward. But let me tell you what's the other problem with the other provinces. You get to our Northwest province in this case, as it were, and let me mention Northwest in this instance. You go and try and locate, hey, where are the ICT related matters for the province are sitting? Which portfolio? I can tell you now that the response and the answer that you get out of that, and it's a very sad situation. But who is in charge of the ICT provincial strategy? And we tried, after we did what we did with Gauteng, I tried to go home and say, let's try this at home. But in terms of where are those things are sitting, if there are priorities around those, yeah, let me leave it at that. But until such time that the implementation part of whatever that we come up with, we have beautiful solutions that we put together. Had the experience when I was in Parliament, where some of the things we presented that this is what we have. But as it has always been the case, when it comes to the putting in of resources and the implementation of some of those things, it remains one of the biggest problems.
Thank you very much. I have a feeling we're gonna have this conversation again. Perhaps we need to have a bigger platform. We should have people from the service providers. We can bring Siemens. We need to bring in your ICAPA, your Centec, and have a broader conversation. Also, most importantly, also have economic development from national to provinces being part of the conversation. And this is something that we can work towards and say, to build South Africa, to bring competitive advantage of our country, we need technology, we need access, we need skills, we need them where the people are. And instead of us all rushing to Gauteng, I should be able to in Moses Kotane and actually change everything that is in Moses Kotane. Thank you very much for this evening. But I will tell you again, I will come knocking again and say, let's have the conversation with a broader audience. And, maybe if we keep having these conversations on a public platform like this one, we may see change.
No, for sure.
Thank you.
Let me say in closing then, thank you for inviting me. And this was quite a humbling experience, for me to come and share, my thinking within the space. Thank you ever so much. And I'm sure we shall keep talking.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Good night.